So I'd like to start by just asking you to tell me a little bit about your personal history, some of your earliest memories, what your childhood was like, what kind of family you grew up in, those kind of things.
Very good. Well, I'm from a very, very small town called Diriomo. It's in the department of Granada, here in Nicaragua. And I am Diriomo. Diriomo. I'm the daughter of a Nicaraguan father and Honduran mother. I'm the second of four brothers and sisters. So I'm from this small town that is, it's on the edge of the Mobacho volcano, and it's legendary for being linked with esotericism. Yeah, to witchcraft.
So I'm from a very small town that is on the edge of the Lake Mombacho, and it is legendary for being linked with witchcraft.
There were probably sacred areas there centuries ago, more than 500 years ago.
Probably because there were sacred areas here about 500 years ago.
I was born and raised there. I lived in Diriomo when the revolution was won. And when the revolution was won, I was 10 years old. And during that time, just like many other of Nicaraguan children, I knew what was going on politically, and I took a political position.
During that time, just as many other Nicaraguan children, I knew what was going on politically, and I took a political position.
I lived the war. I was in the refugee area with the rest of my family. I celebrated the victory of the revolution. And in November of 1979, when I was 10 years old, I began to organize in the Sandinista group.
And in November of 1979, when I was 10 years old, I began organizing in a Sandinista group.
And I think I've been active in organizations for the last 32 years of my life. I've been parts of the political project, and I've been part of the collective that tries to transform lives.
What was your experience like as a 10-year-old becoming organized?
It was, I think I can now recognize in it some sense of freedom, because at that time in my family there were no obstacles to my participation. I think that Nicaraguan society in general lived like a tsunami of freedom, and I remember a big discussion during those days because there was a big citizen meeting to elect the new local mayor. Because there was no mayor anymore, because the previous mayor had been loyal to Somoza. And so at that moment, no one was talking about elections. There were no state powers. There was nothing. Everything was being rebuilt. And and I remember that I voted. And there was a big debate about whether I had a right to vote. Yeah, because I wasn't a citizen, I was a 10-year-old girl. Yeah, exactly.
Because you were so young.
Exactly, this is it. So legally, I didn't have the right, but in that moment, there was a big debate about whether whether I had the right to vote or not. And in the end, they decided yes, because I was there, I was part of the group, and so I voted for the mayor at the age of 10. And the next year, I went to teach people how to read and write. I was 11 years old, and it was an essential experience in my life, in all the sense of the word, because I went for a period of 4 months, I went to live outside of my home in a rural community, and we lived in a big hut with a hut, like a ranch. The walls were made of sugarcane stalks. The floor was dirt floor. There was no bathroom. So very different from the comforts that I had in my house in Didiomo. And I was responsible for teaching a group of adults and elderly people how to teach them how to read and write. And I lived with Don Manuel and Doña Simona's family.
Did your family travel with you?
My mother did. My mother joined the Literacy Crusade because she was a teacher. And after a lot of begging, they finally let me go. There were a lot of times when my mom had to leave, be outside of the community, and during those times, I stayed with the other members of the brigade, and they were all they were still young people, but they were teenagers and young adults. And it was, obviously this impacted my life. It inspired me. It inspired in me a commitment to change, for change. I think it shaped my character to be able to survive in different conditions. And so I think it obviously developed in me a stronger commitment to the revolution. And when I came back from teaching, I went back to school. I think I was in the 5th grade at the time. And I continued being part of my, school group, but I knew that there was something in me that had changed. I mean, I knew that I had this history and experience that was very different from that of my other friends. And so I continued being involved in the revolution as a member of the Sandinista youth and working to organize other youth. And then it became more difficult about 2 or 3 years later because on one hand, my father, he distanced himself from the revolution, and the rest of my family did not. My brothers and my mother and I we continued to be very committed.
Continue to be very committed.
And this implied violent situations at home. My dad exercising power over us, a lot of control, and it was very hard. I think it was a sad adolescence, because I was very, very, very committed to the revolution. And in the end, I decided to leave home when I was 15 years old. And even though I had the support of the rest of my family, I couldn't return to my house. It was very difficult, a very difficult time with a lot of aggression, a lot of clashes, and I think that the revolution was going through a difficult time as well, because the war was getting worse, and there were many friends and many compañeros that were being killed in the front lines of the war. And the work that we were doing in the communities was very difficult because we were recruiting youth. It included political work as well, so people would understand why we were going through the present economic limitations. And it was a very, very hard, very difficult period, but also very hopeful, but very difficult for me personally and politically.
What were you doing at that time after you moved out of the house?
I stayed in high school, and I dedicated the rest of my time to political work. And I lived for a pretty good deal of time with my grandmother. And during some other time of the year, I was involved organizing production battalions, harvesting coffee or cotton with the student brigades, or with political brigades, or receiving political training. Yeah, it was a very intense period. Very, very, very intense. Yes, I think it was peculiar adolescence. I don't think it was very different from that of many of my compañeras, some of the women that you are going to interview. And, a lot of those women I'm now friends with, I met during that time, like Juanita Jiménez, for example. It was very hard because during that time, my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. And in a very subtle way, for this reason, I decided to go back home. And the relationship between my dad and I started to calm down a little bit. But obviously, I never gave up. I remained committed all the way until the end. But it's also true that my mother's sickness implied that I had longer stays at home and spent more time with her. And then finally, my mother decided to she decided to finally separate from my father and to go back to Honduras. And I had to make a decision. I was, I think, 17 or 18 years old, and the decision was whether to remain in Nicaragua or, or to go with my mother and my two younger brothers who were 16 and 14. And I decided to stay because I felt like I wasn't really going to fit in. I still had so much political restlessness. And ironically, I stayed in Nicaragua with my father, with whom I had fought with for my entire life since I was a child. And I think that little by little we both rebuilt our relationship together because we were alone, and our relationship has not broken down in the last 20 years either. And this is the time when I finished high school, and it was when I had to decide if I was going to go to Honduras with my mom or not, because the relationship between my mom and dad obviously had failed a long time ago, and there was violence. There was a situation of domestic violence, and I think that the illness was a reason that motivated my mom to finally make the decision, in spite of all the fears that she had about the possibility of not being able to support her children, or of returning to Honduras after 20 years. And besides, she really loved Nicaragua. She loved the people. She loved the lifestyle. But, well, she had to make some decisions. And I decided to stay and enroll in the university. And it's kind of a funny story because after having had such an extremely politicized childhood and adolescence, and even though I had remained a good student during that time, I recognized that I had a fairly irregular high school education, because I always had to leave school 3 months before classes were over, because I had to go to some type of student battalion or something else. I was never there during the last 3 years. So I decided to study something that didn't have anything to do with humanities or political sciences, and I studied math. Yeah.
Why?
Because I decided, well, let's see. I decided, as I was telling you, to separate myself from the environment of humanities and political science, right? And I wanted to study something. I'd always liked math. And I felt that if I stayed in the humanities department, I ran the risk of going back to getting involved and to continue doing, and that would make my college very irregular too.
What influenced your decision to step back from that focus and turn to math?
I think, well, I think that some things are like transitional times in your life. I think I was finishing school, and I was going to go live outside of my town. I was making a break, organizational break with the organization that I belonged to in my hometown. I was coming to Managua, to live in Managua, to attend the university, and for me, it was the opportunity for a fresh start. And that included that, that crazy idea to study math, and to try to have a more stable higher education experience. But I was not successful in this endeavor. Because 3 years after starting college, I went back to organizing. During my third year, I managed to finish my first and second year successfully. And I think that the mathematicians, we weren't like the group that was most politically sought after, right? I mean, they looked at us as we were from another planet, within the university. But during my third year of college, someone spoke with me and said, "Hey, look, why not?" Someone found out that I had been a student leader in high school and asked me, "Why don't you join UNEN, the National Student Union of Nicaragua? We need someone to be in charge of the cultural affairs within the department." And I said, "Okay, that's fine." I had very interesting classmates, dancers, choreographers, math. They happened to also be mathematicians. And I decided to do it. So after that decision, I was elected president of the science department, which is where the mathematicians and the physicists and the statisticians, we were all housed in that department. And then I was president of the student body. And when that happened, I was again.
For the student? President of the students?
Of the UNEN. Yes. And yeah, at that point, I was totally involved again.
What kind of things were you involved in?
What kind of things were you involved in?
Well, at that time, there was a political clash. Also, it was political because this was when the Sandinista Front lost the elections. They lost the elections, and there was a change in government. So the student movement became a resistance force to fight so that they wouldn't reduce the budget for the universities. This is the this is a historic struggle in defense of the 6% for the universities that happened in the 90s. The struggle for the student transportation subsidy, to continue organizing and involving the university students in the political process, to work to keep the revolution alive, although it wasn't, although the Sandinista Front was no longer in power, to keep education free of charge, so that there would be education free of charge, to have need-based scholarships. And so this obviously required a lot of work and a lot of organization, because there were many student strikes, and we were out in the streets for many months, showing that there was support for adequate budgets, So, for budgets to be allocated according to what the law prescribed, so that the universities didn't become privatized. And there were very nice days. And I believe that a lot of us felt that we were continuing the work of the revolution. And we slept at the university a lot. And we were out on the streets, on strikes. We were doing a lot of work in the barrios as well, a lot of political work, and we'd ride on the buses to explain to the people why we had to fight for free education, what higher education really meant for a country, and why we had to invest in education. And we went to the barrios, and we went house to house, and we went to the markets, and we had cultural evenings, and we had cultural evenings with candles at night in the barrios. And obviously, we also had the first confrontations with the police. For example, I experienced a tear gas bomb for the first time. I experienced the effect of a tear gas bomb.
How did you move from being a student organizer?
How did you move from being a student organizer to being an organizer pivotal in the women's movement?
Well, let's see. About the middle of the 1990s, I was part of, through my leadership in the university, I was part of an very interesting project that was called the Constitution of the Youth Council of Nicaragua. And there were representatives from almost all of the youth organizations in the country were present at that council. And it was a very beautiful project because for the first time in the early 90s, youth that had been on one side of the trenches met with youth that had been on the other side. Yes, in the war. And so there we were, Sandinista youth, along with Contra youth. And obviously at first it was, no, right? I don't want to sit close to you. I don't want to, And we all came wearing our bandanas to show our alliances, so there would be no doubt that either side was ceding. But little by little, we were young, and we started to share things. And we began to identify problems that we had in common. We began to see that we were the same. We were all youth. And we began to engage in recreational activities as well. And a group of women that was there, we decided to make a group of women leaders, a group of women youth leaders.
What made you decide that?
What made you decide that?
Because we felt that the way the youth organizations were organized, they weren't recognizing the leadership nor the contribution of women. We felt that the programs and the work plans of the youth organizations were not incorporating the demands and needs of young women. And some of us needed to have our own space to reflect upon things. So it was very nice because this group of women, we came out of the youth movement, but some of us started to make connections with the women's movement. And we started to participate in the forums of the women's movement. And the women's movement was also going through a very beautiful period, right? I mean, they were going through this moment of national diversity. And I mean, it was the boom of the women's movement in Nicaragua. And we were like, hey, here we come. Here are the youth. We want our space. Because it looks like we don't really have it here either. I mean, what I mean is that we felt that in the co-ed youth organizations, there was resistance to incorporate the demands of women. And that in the women's movement, there was resistance to recognize the needs of the young. So we were sort of stuck here in the middle, kind of battling within both groups. And this was at a point when I broke away from the Sandinista youth. And I was finishing my studies. And then at this moment, at this time, the women's movement called me and said, you know what, we want you to join us. And I was leaving following a very strong break within my organization, which was tied to the first rupture of the Sandinista Front that led to the creation of the Sandinista Renewal Movement. And I think I was already heavily involved with the women's movement. I had already participated in the Latin American Feminist Encounter. I had the opportunity to go to a meeting of young women leaders in Chile, a women's political meeting. And that was that bond with the young Chilean feminists, and that was very important for me. And I was already heavily involved with the women's movement. And during that time, at the end of 1994, I was 25 years old. I was finishing my studies. And the Network of Women Against Violence chose me to coordinate a national campaign against violence.
Wow, so young.
Yes. And it was a job that I was going to do for 3 months. And I stayed 9 years.
Why did you stay so long?
I stayed 9 years because well, it was to organize this national campaign was a marvelous experience. It taught me so much, because we started to work on the idea to organize a campaign where everyone could be a part of. We started to use colors, and we used colors and symbols. We started to use this badge as a way to be part of the campaign. And that helped so that you didn't have to go to a march or to a meeting that women could participate even if they weren't necessarily politically active in the women's movement, or they didn't necessarily work in a women's organization. It meant that, the secretary, the bank teller, the housewife, the student, they could all participate just by wearing the badge on their clothes, or on their backpack, or on the purse.
Can you tell us
very briefly what this campaign was about?
The campaign was to demand that the government of Nicaragua ratify the Inter-American Convention of Violence Against Women. I think that a lot of people didn't necessarily understand the name, Inter-American Convention. It sounds so grandiose, but basically it was about the people signing a paper and wearing a badge that said, I am in favor of the government getting involved and for the government to legislate in favor of women's right to live without violence. And the campaign was called, I Want to Live Without Violence. And so all this led to a lot of people to say, I want to be part of this, I want to organize, how do I do it? And it went from being an initiative where there were approximately 18 organizations. It turned into a network of more than 150 organizations. In addition to having a lot of women participate individually. And we organized national meetings, and we worked very hard so that the National Assembly would pass the law that for the first time in the history of the country would recognize and punish domestic violence. And, it was very intense work. We collected more than 40,000 signatures from citizens. We did a lobbying campaign. We went to each of the representatives' homes and we talked with the representatives' wives. We were at the National Assembly every day. We made alliances with the representatives' secretaries. We asked people to send fax so that they would really jam the representatives' fax machines so they would pass this law. And the women in the National Assembly, the secretaries, the women from the cafeteria would give us lunch so that we could be there all day. I mean, we were persistent. Until finally, in 1996, this law was passed. And I think that this law, which has since it's had many reforms, but I think that it definitely contributed to saving many women's lives, definitely. We were also part of this project that's called Family Services Division. These are specialized police stations that focus on domestic violence, and they're a pilot project in Latin America. I think they only exist in Peru, in Nicaragua, and I think in Ecuador. And we were part of this project that aimed to open more stations in more places and to have these centers that were part of the Women's Network, to have them make a commitment to serving women that reported violence. And well, I stayed for 9 years. And as the network's executive secretary until 2003, until August 2003. Obviously, I lived through many intense events during this period, such as Soy la América Narváez's lawsuit against Daniel Ortega. And that was very intense at both the political and personal levels, because although I hadn't been active within the Sandinista front for a long time, I wasn't active. I wasn't part of the party anymore, of the front, for many years. But I still had a very strong history with them, and this lawsuit helped me to realize that during the time that I spent teaching people how to read and write, I had lived through a situation of sexual abuse from another adolescent in the community, and that at that time I had not recognized it as such, but that it had been traumatic for me. And I had never, I had pretty much erased that part of my past, but through Soy la América's lawsuit, I was able to recognize that that what happened, that those aggressions, sexual aggressions of that teenager towards me had been sexual violence, and that it had impacted my life during that period. That I had succeeded in getting over it. I think that it was because I had been able to leave the community, and I returned home, and I found my classmates, and I went back to being a girl. But it had been sexual violence, and just like Soy la América, but in a different context, I had never talked about it. Never. I had never talked about it, and I didn't even talk about it in that moment. I didn't talk about it with my mom, who was there, not with the teachers. I didn't talk with absolutely anyone. So I think that that was obviously a very difficult thing, because a lot of women decided to talk. This made it so that the topic of sexual violence in Nicaragua was finally on the table. We questioned ourselves a lot, and I think it was very harsh for the Sandinista front to create this protective wall protecting Ortega, or that the way it responded, it didn't distance itself from the personal actions of its leader, but instead it took actions to protect him. And besides that, this decision to protect him at all costs had meant a transcendental change in the political structure of the country, because this really created the conditions for the pact between Daniel Ortega and Arnoldo Alemán. Because what they exchanged was mutual impunity. So obviously this was very tough for us. It was very tough for me, right? Because Soy la América's lawsuit was a time of mourning for us. We cried because we felt betrayed. Because Ortega was, although we didn't all necessarily know him personally, there was some important figure of him in all of our lives' history. So it led us to question many things, and it was, they refused to acknowledge and to support the victim. And obviously this event created a very big clash within the network. So it implied putting a lot of energy into many debates for reflection purposes. I think that it required a lot of political maturity among us, a lot of understanding of the process that each of us wanted to take, and that we couldn't force anyone. It was a personal process, right? And my departure from the network, I finally made the decision to leave the coordination of it in 2003. This year, the network was tied to, in that year we accompanied Rosita, the 9-year-old girl that was pregnant. She had been sexually abused, and we supported her in her demand to terminate the pregnancy. And it was very, 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 very hard, politically and personally too, because it meant to face the clerics, the church with all of its power. And we knew that was a political fight, and a right, a human right, but it was also a matter of life. I mean, the risk to the girl of going through labor. So what I mean is we couldn't wait for the church and the state to make a decision 2 years later because of the risk. The girl's life was in danger, and we had to make decisions, right? And this was very hard for us. And that year, I decided to leave the network because I had to put some distance. I had worked there for 9 years, although not always. Well, my job was political. I was a facilitator. I was a political manager. But I also had to deal with and confront and listen to a lot of personal stories. And I think that just as many of other women that have worked in the issue of violence against women, there's a moment when you have to make a cut. You have to take a break. And I left the network, and I left to work in the leadership of a much broader coalition of NGOs. And the network was actually a part of it, and it was called the Civil Coordinator.
Violeta, can I ask you, did you experience any personal consequences from your support surrounding Zoila or Rosita?
Consecuencia como personal por el trabajo que estaba haciendo con Zoila, América y con Rosita. Habían consecuencias personales como resultado de ese trabajo que habías hecho.
Yes, I think that in the case of Soy America's charges, I think it was in 98, so it's been about 13 years, right, approximately. And I think that because a lot of us women backed Soy America at that moment, that has marked us. It's marked us as people that we aren't. I mean, as enemies of the Sandinista party. And this implies, enemies of the Sandinista front. And this meant that we were not, it wasn't really seen as a rift within the movement, but that we were no longer recognized as leaders of a political movement, and public organizations are not allowed to establish any type of relationship with us. And obviously, we can't access any type of government job, right?
And was there also a governmental response?
And was there also a governmental response to your support of Rosita?
Obviously, well, in Rosita's case, at first there was a lot of pressure coming from the church. They excommunicated us. And obviously, I have been Catholic all my life, and that was going to have an impact on my family, my father's side of the family. And they talked about my excommunication at the church in my town. And at some point I was scared that there would be a break between me and my community. For me, although I no longer lived in Diriomo, it had been several years since I didn't live there. But for me, it always remained a vital space. But it was very interesting, actually, because I think that the community was very supportive of me. The old ladies, my grandmothers, they would say, "No, that priest is crazy." That was very good. But later, after that pressure, which was more emotional, then the government, when the Sandinista Front came to power, it made use of the law, and there was a judicial lawsuit, a criminal accusation, and that had a much stronger impact on us because we were accused, we were investigated. We were accused and we were investigated. We were called to testify. Officials of the Sandinista government treated us like delinquents.
as if we were delinquents.
They treated us as aggressors.
Treated us as aggressors.
This had an impact on my family because obviously my mom, who was still alive, she always worried about me because of what could happen to me in the country. I already had a son that had been born in 2004, and obviously I worried that if I was arrested, what was going to happen to my baby? It obviously impacted my job too, because I had to invest a lot of time in going to the judicial and political defense. And a lot of time, a lot of meetings, a lot of debates to try to understand what was happening and which was the best strategy. And a lot of time invested to not fall prey to the government strategy to divide us. For example, we decided not to go and testify individually and to declare ourselves politically accused, because the government was hoping that I would accuse my friend and to interrogate us. And so then one of us would say, no, it wasn't me. I wasn't the one who took the girl. It was her. Or, who were the doctors that terminated the pregnancy, who was there at that time. So they wanted to use our testimonies to pit us against each other. And we decided not to do it, not to fall in that strategy and to declare ourselves politically accused, right? And to not give any individual testimony. And this lasted 3 years. It lasted 3 years.
So it was all of these pressures.
So it was all of these pressures that led you to decide to take a step back. You started to tell me a little bit about what you did next. You started to work on issues more in civil society.
With the civil coordinator, yes. Yes, that was very interesting because I went back to a co-ed space after 9 years. And I liked it because I went back to dealing with numbers. I got to lead and monitor issues of economic policies and to work with economists. And I followed all the policies of the IMF. And it was very interesting because the economists that were there looked at me and thought, okay. At this time, I was already 34 years old. And I was coming from the women's movement. And more than one of them were saying, what are we going to do with this woman? A lot of them didn't know that I was a mathematician, and it ended up working very well. We did very interesting things, and we did amazing research on the subject of political economics. We discovered sums of money that the government collected and did not enter into the budget, and we demanded that it be used for social programs and that there be better transparency. And we developed very interesting training processes on economic subjects. We developed very interesting training processes on economic subjects. It was very, very good for me. Working there, I met a man that, I had a relationship with him and became pregnant. And I think it could only happen that way, going back to a co-ed environment. Because Because I spent the previous 9 years exclusively dealing with my female friends and peers. So my son was born. His name is Diego. And I was there for 3 years. And I decided to leave the civil coordinator because I decided to become involved in the electoral campaign of the Sandinista renewal movement during the 2006 elections. I ran for Congress, and that was also very interesting for me. It seems like there are some key transitional times in my life, right? I think that the first time of transition was the Literacy Crusade, teaching people how to read and write, the triumph of the revolution and the crusade. After that, I think it was the decision to study math and go to college. And then it was the clash with the Sandinistas and the beginning of my work. Well, not with the Sandinista movement, but with the FSLN and the beginning of my work with the network. And then it was the decision to resign from my work at the civil court coordinator to go on to the electoral campaign, because on the one hand, I went back to be part of a partisan political project. It had been 12 years since 94, and I had some desire to do it because I had spent a lot of time being a political manager, right? Meaning that I had a lot of ties with the women's movement leadership and with the community leaders. But to go back to an electoral campaign was to go back to the communities, back to, good morning, I'm Violeta Delgado, I'm a candidate for Congress, and I would like you to vote for me because I am a woman committed to women's rights. It was going back to looking people directly in the eyes, those personal ties without intermediaries. So I went all over the country for 6 months, together with Azalia, the other friend who was my running mate, and going back to a partisan life after so many years. It was great. It was very nice. It was a decision that I made almost like, I want to live this, right? Like plugging your nose and jumping into the pool. You understand? Because this obviously has a cost. A lot of people question whether to give you a job or not, because the majority of organizations will say, well, but she has a partisan bias that isn't convenient, right? And I also started to work as an independent consultant, and I was running a risk because a lot of Sandinista organizations or ones that are close to the rebels wouldn't give me work because of my political affiliation. Besides, after being recognized as a partisan civil society leader for so long, as a social leader, to then go and wear a party's T-shirt, that meant 100,000 risks. But I decided to do it, and I decided to plug my nose and jump into the pool because I wanted to live this electoral campaign.
And how did you end up at the Center for Media and Democracy where you are now?
Well, okay. Why did I come to CINCO? I came to work at CINCO because after the electoral campaign, which ended with a victory for Ortega as president, and I was not elected, we didn't receive. We received an important number of votes. This is a little party with 5 candidates, but it wasn't enough votes for me to be elected. So the moment came where I decided to separate my life, my active participation in the women's movement, from my work life. Because for many years I had been a political manager with a salary, right? Paid for by the organizations where I worked. So I decided to use my mathematical education, to dig into the closet and refresh my academic training. And suddenly many of my friends said, good, you're good at doing numbers. So Sophia told me, the majority of many of the employees from CINCO are humanists. They're journalists, communication specialists, sociologists. But when it comes to the numbers and matrices and those things, they just don't want to have anything to do with it. So I said, okay. And Sophia offered me a job as project manager to deal with all the numbers. And on the other side, to continue my active involvement with the women's movement on the side. And so I got involved with MOM, the Women's Autonomous Movement. I'm part of its political coordination, but I like it a lot because I'm not a paid staff member. So to be able to separate my work life from my, although, we have to say quote unquote, because at CINCO we do engage in a lot of political debate, a lot of debate about what is current events. It's an organization that takes a political position. I like that part of this project a lot. And I'm also very happy, satisfied with my involvement in the women's autonomous movement. And that's where I am right now. I separated from my son's father about a year after he was born. We're very good friends. At this moment, I don't have a partner. And I really, really, really enjoy my son. He will soon be 7 years old, and he's a lovely boy. He's in the 1st grade. He plays soccer. He loves food. He's a super loving person. We love each other very much.
Well, I'd like to switch gears.
Well, I'd like to switch gears and ask you, throughout your work as a woman, how have you made sense of, or how do you define feminism?
Well, that I always reference the fact that once at the start of the 90s, when I was involved with the youth movement and I sort of flirted with the women's movement, one time I heard Marcela Lagarde. She's this feminist, fabulous Mexican feminist anthropologist. And she said a phrase that went like, and it made me think, that's it. That's where I want to be. She said, feminism is a proposal for humanity. So it's a proposal from women to humanity. And when we say for humanity, it's for all of us. And because of that, then I understood why as feminists, we had a proposition for sustainable development, right? We had like a vision, cosmovision. We questioned spirituality. We proposed the idea of fair and equal relationships with respect to men. So for me, feminism obviously transcends my participation in a women's organization. That's where I advocate for it. Others have other ways to advocate for it. I think that for me, feminism is a proposal that comes from women, but it's a proposal for change in men and in humanity as at large. It's all connected.
Do you call yourself a feminist?
Yes, definitely. I'm a feminist.
And do you see a relationship?
And do you see a relationship between feminist activism and scholarship or work from the university?
Una relación entre la parte académica y el feminismo.
I think that in Nicaragua, like in no other country really, maybe in Central America, but I would say like in no other region of the world, well, personally, I was able to be part of a very interesting case where the results from one investigation were then used as material to create an impact by women on the issue of violence against women. I was able to be part of very interesting formative processes where female academics engaged in many debates with women in the community. I think that in Nicaragua, like in no other country, there is a recognition for these women's wisdom. Community leaders that have never been to college but whose life experiences are of vital importance. And I think that the theorists feed a lot from these vital life experiences. Even myself, although I could be identified as a feminist that has not worked directly with women to create transformations in their lives, I am not, quote unquote, an intellectual. Like those, well, I studied math. Sure, but I think that I have incorporated into my life methods to analyze reality. I think that throughout my 42 years, I have learned techniques to do political synthesis and identify lessons learned. I think that, and not just me, I think that Nicaraguan feminists, even though many of them have never set foot in a university, they have developed the ability for political abstraction. In other words, the ability to synthesize their life story and their experiences in order to gain knowledge. I think that what we've lacked are the resources to write it. Yeah.
You've also talked about your experience working with women's organizations from other countries.
Can you tell me about some
of your international experience working on women's issues?
Yes, well, it's been in a variety of ways. On the one hand, I have been part of the process to form feminist regional alliances. And this has been super, super, super great. I think that if it weren't for this, a lot of us would have been in a situation of greater risk. For example, all of the supportive campaigns organized by the feminists from Central America and Latin America to support Nicaraguan feminists during 2008 and 2009, when Ortega's policy was very aggressive towards us. Many feminists organized outside of the entrance to the Nicaraguan embassies and also at the airports, visibly showing their opposition to Ortega's visit to their country. I think that was very strong. So yes, I have been involved in creating projects and processes and very strong alliances between us, among us in Mesoamerica and in Latin America. It was also very interesting because during the period when I worked and I was in the leadership of the Women's Network Against Violence, I could also identify the differences in what we were doing with what other organizations were developing, particularly in the north. I mean, I was able to visit. I visited homeless shelters in the United States, in Wisconsin, in Europe. But the difference is that what we were, we had a feminist vision. And we were a very politicized social movement, nonpartisan, but very much politicized. Politicized in terms of not just, what I mean is that we took in victims, we supported them in the process of transforming their lives, but in addition to that, we were a political organization with certain demands. We demanded changes in legislation. We monitored public policies, and later on, we also had an official position on what we thought of the course of the country was taking. When we found out about how women's access to justice was being impacted by the government structure becoming partisan, the fact that party representatives now held high offices. For example, if women were going to a Sandinista judge, and the judge and the aggressor were both Sandinistas, then there was no possibility that he would go to jail. And this happened after the pact between Ortega and Alemán in 1998. So this forced us to take a political position. So when we made trips abroad, we would say, yes, we do that. But we also have a position about what goes on in the country. And we are a political movement that demands changes. We don't just take care of victims.
Violeta, in addition to your regional organizing, have you made use of international treaties or meetings like the United Nations, for example?
Yes. I was in Beijing. I was in the conference in Beijing. Yes. And I participated in subsequent meetings every 5 years where we revised the platform. And, well, like many of my peers, I got to face off with the delegates from the government of Nicaragua, look for them in the hallways, pressure them so that they didn't sign with the Vatican, lobby the delegates from other countries. And in recent years, I've been able, together with other peers, to go to the UN Human Rights Courts and to go to the Inter-American Human Rights Commission of the OAS to denounce the state of human rights for the women in Nicaragua. Let me say that I don't tell this very often. I should have brought the book. I forgot. But in 2004, I was selected along with 5 other Nicaraguan women to be part of this group called 1,000 Peacewomen. In 2004, a Swiss organization nominated 1,000 women from all over the world to be candidates for the Nobel Peace Prize. This Swiss organization proposed to the Nobel Committee that they give the prize to 1,000 women of the world as a symbol of a symbol for women in peace. They didn't give us the Nobel Prize, but
what an honor to be nominated.
Yeah, nominated. Yes, I was nominated along with Vilma Núñez and 4 other Nicaraguan women. And I think that every year, during the last few years, we've been nominated. I just came back from Argentina last week from a meeting with other women who were also nominated from Ecuador and Mexico, because we try to communicate amongst ourselves and keep in touch.
And do you use some of the strategizing?
And do you use some of the strategizing that you're doing across these regional networks? Has part of that involved using this international discourse on human rights?
Definitely. In the first place, it's been very difficult to get recognition for this work. Well, it's work that I think has a precedent since the Vienna Conference of 1994, for women's rights to be acknowledged as human rights. I mean that it's in Nicaragua. The places the ways in which one can press charges are very limited for various reasons. Because the government has bought almost all of the mass media outlets. You know that it has bought almost all of the television channels and radio stations. And there is very little possibility of engaging in public demonstrations, because groups that are close to the government come and they hate you and they follow you. So obviously the international sphere is one of the few places we still have to condemn what is happening. And the spaces, the human rights forums, are the spaces that we've used the most. One of our friends, Azalia Solis, worked on a document that I think has made a big contribution. It's going to contribute greatly in the near future to support human rights, because she made a document of a report made to the Committee of Rights of the Child regarding the ban, the penalization of abortion in Nicaragua as a violation of children's rights. Clearly, many pregnant teenagers who cannot terminate a pregnancy, many of them are minors. They're still girls, and it's obviously a situation of violation of human rights.
Violeta, can you talk a little about give me some concrete examples of how the women's movement has made advances in women's health?
In terms of health. Okay. Well, I think that one main contribution has been. I think there are 2 main contributions. One, all the work that the women's organizations have done to have violence against women recognized as a major health problem. You know, there is a government survey from 1995 that says, the results said that out of every 10 women, Nicaraguan women, 10 women that lived violence, only 3 talked about their situation. This was a 1995 survey. The last survey, which I think is from 2007, says that 6 out of every 10 women talk about it.
contribute to that change?
How did the women's movement contribute to that change?
Well, 100%. I mean, the first people that started to bring this up, building on all these things that I told you about, the badge campaign, the law, the signatures, right? We were the women's organizations. And first of all, I think that this was a transcendental cultural and political contribution. When I was a girl, I never realized that my dad's aggressions, his emotional aggressions towards my mom, they were violent and that they were a crime. I never realized it. Never. I knew it was, I knew that it hurt me, that it made me very sad. And my mom never considered reporting it, ever. Because it wasn't recognized as a crime either. You know? Not in my family, not in my community. No one was going to report an incident of domestic violence. It didn't mean, it meant sometimes there was some level of restriction from the community, but in some cases not even that. It was just something that happened. It happened, period.
So women
You know?
will report it now.
So women will report it now.
So all these years later, it's recognized as something that isn't right and that it's an offense. So we contributed so that the rates of reporting, for them to really have a 180-degree transformation, I think. I also think that to bring up abortion, the debate of abortion, when before the whole issue with surrounding Rosita's pregnancy and the termination of that pregnancy, nobody was even talking about abortion in Nicaragua. Only some groups, not even all the feminists, and not even all of the women's movement as a whole. It didn't have a position on the issue. It didn't even talk about the right to abortion. Abortion is a word, like a friend of mine says, that people mentioned quietly and covering their mouths. So now, all these years later, this subject has been put up for debate. And now people talk about it, either in favor or against it, whether it's through different social networks or television programs or whatever. But they talk about it and they debate the issue of abortion. And that, I think, is an extremely important contribution. If the subject isn't brought up and it continues being taboo, the life stories of women that secretly terminate their pregnancies and die from it. A lot of them teenagers. So many of the teenagers that commit suicide because of an unwanted pregnancy and because they don't want to confront their family. Also the stories of women who now can't terminate their pregnancy because of the criminalization of therapeutic abortion. So they die or put their lives at risk. So all this work, all these reports and demands that the women's movement has done. And on the other hand, there's this painstaking task from hundreds of women's organizations that have a clinic. They provide health services. They hand out flyers. They do trainings and put together communication campaigns about sexual and reproductive rights that no one else does in this country, and that the government doesn't do, the churches don't do, no one else does it. I think that, yes, there's been a transcendental contribution.
Violeta, you've also talked about some international issues. I'm interested in your opinion of whether or not you think neoliberal policies or this idea of globalization has any unique consequences for women in Nicaragua.
Obviously, the model in itself had awful consequences. I mean, from the starting with the late 80s, when the Sandinista Front was still in power,
After the 80s, since when the Sandinistas were still in power,
we started to see a reduction of the government. The government started becoming smaller, and a lot of people took to the street. There was unemployment, or what the Sandinista government called compression. And from 1990 and on, with Violeta Chamorro's victory, the metal settled in aggressively. Privatization and the privatization of social services, the reduction of the state, the decrease in social spending, and the Nicaraguan government just got rid of the majority of social programs, so that all the children's programs had to be taken on by hundreds of NGOs. Sexual and reproductive health services for women stopped being responsibility of the state, and they were basically taken on mostly by the women's organizations. Besides, keep in mind that Chamorro's government had a big, her government was greatly influenced by the top-level hierarchy of the Catholic Church. So politics got in the way. The refusal to have policy designed to provide comprehensive sexual and reproductive health programs, we ended up doing all of that ourselves. At the moment, almost 100% of all services for victims of violence are still in hands of women's organizations. The government of Nicaragua doesn't even have a shelter, not even a protection center, not one single center to serve female victims, because evidently this isn't allowed, because the government, according to the liberal model, could not be a service provider, but just a manager, right? A political manager. And all the rest was privatized, including everything that is related to the protection of rights, particularly of women's rights. So obviously, yes, these neoliberal policies that are still implemented with Ortega's government, they continue then falling on the shoulders of women.
Well, Violeta, I want to thank you very much for your time today. But before we end, I want to make sure there isn't any other topic that you'd like to talk about that I haven't asked you about.
No, I don't think so.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for talking to us for so long.
Thank you for talking to us for so long. It's an honor that we get to speak with somebody who was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize.
Or also, can I still say something, just in case you need it?
Yes, please.
Yeah, can I? With the camera, or did you already turn it off?
It's still on.
Okay, because maybe you'll use it, or maybe it'll be edited. I just thought about it. No, well, I just want to say in the end that I have to pay homage to the women in my family. Yes, I think that certainly the liberating example of my mother and many other women that didn't doubt letting me spread my wings when I was 10 years old, I think they marked the course of my life. And I wanted to say that.
Thank you for sharing that.
It's very important. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, you've been so busy, your life organizing.
Well, you've been so busy in your life organizing around so many political issues.
Acerca de varias cuestiones, varios temas.
Yeah.
About your upcoming election.
What do you think about your upcoming election?
Well, we always, maybe because of Sophia's influence, we always have an apocalyptic discourse, and us Nicaraguans always have an apocalyptic discourse. You know, these are things that happen that are going to mark a dramatic change in the country.
This is an event that's going to mark a very drastic change.
And I think
What do you want to see happen?
What do you want to see happen?
¿Qué quieres que pase?
one, that people participate, because I believe that the biggest adversary of democracy is the skepticism and incredulity prevail. The biggest adversary of democracy is that skepticism and incredulity prevail. That the lack of confidence prevails. Lack of confidence. And that people don't participate. I think that is the biggest enemy, more so than the results.
In the past, Nicaragua, a high percentage of Nicaraguans used to vote, and that's changed. What happened?
Well, on the one hand, the partisanship of the Supreme Election Council, because there isn't much confidence that your vote is going to be respected. Because the Supreme Election Council is in the hands of the Sandinista Front. Ortega has total control. Ortega's children live in the home of the president of the Supreme Election Council in Costa Rica.
The children of Ortega live in the house of the Corte Suprema.
Well, the president of the Supreme Election Council has a house in Costa Rica. And Ortega's children that study in Costa Rica live in this house. So there's this relationship, a very strong personal and political alliance. And so I think that a lot of people, they don't feel, they don't want to be duped by going to vote and for their decision not to be respected. I think that the main enemy is absenteeism, not going to vote.
The people have become disillusioned in democracy.
The people have become disillusioned with democracy.
The disenchantment of democracy, yes, and of the political classes. But
Why does Ortega send his kids to study in Costa Rica?
As I understand it, he sent them to study film and television, and I think that there is a school in Costa Rica or a department at Well, now those children that used to live there, they are now the directors of the television channels that Ortega has bought.
I think now they're the directors of
Ortega has bought,
that Ortega has bought.
in just 1 year, he's bought 3 television channels, meaning he is the owner of 4 channels. Channel 4, Channel 11, Channel 13, and Channel 8. In the last year, he bought 3.
How many channels are there?
Let's see. I mentioned those 4. And then there's CNN, 100%, Channel 12, Channel 2, and Channel 10. There are 9.
There are 9, and he owns 4.
Of those 9, 4 belong to Ortega. I'm sorry, excuse me, 5. Because Channel 10 isn't his, but he owns half, and the other half belongs to Carlos Slim, the Mexican millionaire.
Channel 10, he owns half, and the other one is owned by this Mexican millionaire.
And which stations are
Of 10, 5 belong to Ortega.
And which stations are the major news programs on?
Well, these 5 channels are propaganda channels for Ortega, and each channel, Channel 8 is directed by Ortega's son, and Channel 13 is directed by a daughter. So his children are directing the television channels. And I think that only Channel 12 is doing some type of independent journalism. The rest that Ortega hasn't already bought, try not to talk about politics for fear that they might pull the publicity funding and suffer retaliation. So yes, I think that at this time, the population isn't completely aware of the risks that this country is going through because, obviously we don't have the same Sandinismo of the 1980s, which was committed to specific ethics, and it still made mistakes, right? But now it's a family. It's Ortega, it's his wife, and his children who make all the decisions. It's a dynasty. Like the one in Tunisia, and we run the risk of not even having elections in a few years, or having a pantomime of elections.
Do you think if he loses the electoral vote that he'll actually step down?
¿Y qué pasaría si él perdiera las elecciones? ¿Crees que realmente bajaría de su posición? ¿Saldría de su posición?
I think that is a complicated situation. I think because on the one hand, if this happens, I hope we would have to go back and restart things through a gigantic process of national reconciliation. Because I think that all these things that I told you about that we achieved 20 years ago, do you understand that the Sandinista youth, we sat down with the Contra youth and we talked and we realized, it isn't that bad. So in the last 5 years, we've regressed. What I mean is that there are friends of mine who are in the government with whom we have been friends since childhood who today do not speak to me. Or neighbors who have gone head to head with their neighbors. So it's become more polarized. In 5 years, the steps we had taken forward, we took many backwards. I think it's necessary to ensure that the Sandinistas, including those who support Ortega right now, feel that they continue to be part of this nation. I hope that the loss of Ortega finally leads to changes inside the party to really make it a democratic party. I think that it had a terrible regression in the past couple of years. And on the other hand, that this leads to a different leadership for the Sandinista party in the country, a more democratic one, and one that ostracizes Ortega's caudillo attitude. I hope that if he loses the elections, he goes to Venezuela or to Cuba, and then he goes into exile with whomever.
Well, we've kept you longer. I know we're all probably hungry for lunch.
Yeah, okay. Yes.